The events of the last few months have shown us a great deal of cursory attention has been paid to the American Revolution. You've seen radical groups, far right, militia type groups, sporting 1776 tattoos, flags saying "Don't tread on me," and the list goes on and on. So obviously there is a working knowledge, if not a complete and total knowledge, of the American Revolution. We're going to take a look at the Revolution from three different aspects. We'll take a look at the initial causes. We'll take a look at the military aspect of it and how tenuous this entire thing was. And then we'll take a look at the effects, which you could argue are still being fought today. Now, one of the founding fathers, the FFs, is John Adams. And Adams is often given credit for a quote that I'm going to paraphrase somewhat on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now, he dies on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, a document which he helped pen along with, of course, the main author, and that, of course, is Thomas Jefferson. Both of them die in 1826 on the 50th anniversary, one of those strange historical occurrences. So Adams, as it was approaching that date, was asked about the significance of the revolution in 1776. And Adams looked at his questioner and said, "The revolution? That was not the American Revolution. The American Revolution began in the minds of the American people in 1760. So what was he referring to, and exactly what was the American Revolution?"
The saga of the American Revolution begins. In Boston, political radicals encourage the acts that lead to the revolution, and 13 divided, ill-prepared colonies reluctantly join forces to battle the most powerful nation on earth.
Passion governs, and she never governs wisely.
The colonies are not to be emancipated.
All men are created equal, victory or death.
Behind me is Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Inside, men in funny-looking, brightly colored coats and powdered wigs selected Virginia plantation owner George Washington as commander-in-chief of a rebel army, debated and signed the Declaration of Independence, and drafted the United States Constitution. Those men and that time are wrapped in a mythical patriotic fog. Join us as we lift that fog to discover the very human men and women who shaped one of the most influential and exciting periods in history, the American Revolution. It was a war that began in a single bloody...
Now, we all know that the big names associated with the revolution, the Washingtons, the Franklins, as I've mentioned previously, Adams and Jefferson. However, if it was just those men, if it was just those types of men, then this would never have succeeded. This was a revolution. This was an event which engulfed the entire country. It was an event which pitted literally brother against brother, son versus father, mother versus daughter, etc. And it was an event that encompassed all the people. And if it wasn't for the average person, this would never have succeeded. So, what was it that brought about this passion, and what was it that brought this to the events that were going to occur when April 19th, 1775, when the first shot heard round the world was fired? Let's take a look. You see there listed was the events which led to this growing spirit of unity. Remember, these people primarily thought of themselves as British. The term Americans, patriot, independence barely existed in the average talk of the people of that day. As a matter of fact, independency, as it was oftentimes referred to, was looked upon as an insult. Patriots, patriotism, uh, words not often understood by the average person. So, what was it that finally took them out of the shell of being British to that of being Americans? Well, again, generally speaking, it's going to be common experiences. We've previously talked about the Great Awakening, when religion tried to reestablish itself in some form uh, in the average colonial person's life. It had lost some of its fervor as a result of the Salem witch trials. And then as time went on, people just lost their religious attachments in many instances, not so much in New England, but in the rest of the colonies. Well, the Great Awakening transported, as many traditions were, from England to America, spread throughout the colonies. Therefore, this experience of this religious revival stretched all the way from Georgia up through and including the Massachusetts Bay colonies. So the Great Awakening was a common experience, and it was an experience which challenged common doctrine. This was an experience which said that each person had within him the power, the authority to chart his own course when it came to worship, religion, and most importantly, salvation. Then the French and Indian Wars, uh, which dotted American history, starting in the late 1600s and going all the way through to that which we saw George Washington ignited in 1754, the French and Indian War, which lasted, of course, 7 years. The French and Indian War, once again, was an experience that was fought all along the colonial boundaries, from the Deep South up into New England. So, once again, a common experience, but an experience which saw them beat in their minds the French. This gave them a tremendous amount of pride. And because of some of the British missteps, particularly early in the war, they saw the British as fallible. And they themselves took credit for this victory. And lastly, let's go back to the idea that I mentioned in previous lectures, and that was this idea of salutary neglect. And of course, all of that prompted by the distance which existed between the colonies and the mother country. That distance cannot be overstated. We're talking about, forget the mileage, we're talking about 2 months sometimes between communications, which made it very difficult for the British to control the colonies. And so, therefore, they did not attempt to do that until after the French and Indian War. They followed an official policy known as salutary neglect, where rules would be passed by the British Parliament and the King, but enforced by their own local authorities, their own duly elected governments. They were used to governing themselves. And when that was in danger of being taken away, well, then that was going to pose a problem. So, who were these Americans? Who were these colonists that felt this way, that shared this common experience? Well, there's a number of things that made them Americans, if you will. First of all, if you came over here, you had a bit of courage to begin with. You're going into a foreign, alien environment, if you will, where environment is unlike that which you had ever experienced, and you're going out on your own. These were, as I put there on the screen, risk takers. They could not afford to maintain certain traditions because then they would not survive. So automatically, they were forced to be different. The conditions that they found themselves in, well, number one, landowners, almost, and I underline the word almost, all of them were landowners. This was not the case in England for a variety of reasons. Uh, England had been suffering, number one, from a lack of employment. As their population increased, there were less jobs available for those people. And because of laws that existed, namely one called primogeniture, which I had mentioned to you talking about early colonization, meant that the firstborn got everything. So large pieces of land increasingly were put in the hands of just one person. So people were coming over here, and for the first time, they became landowners, either as people who were given the land by royal charter, or as indentured servants earned the land themselves, or in many cases, they just took it as they moved further and further west. 80%, 80% of the American people participated in politics. And by that, I mean largely voting. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about white males. This did not include Native Americans. It did not include, obviously, women. It did not include slaves and, obviously, free blacks. But of those eligible to participate, 80% did. Compare that with, example, the last election we just had, the one where Joe Biden defeats Donald Trump. That was considered to be an anomaly because over 70% of all Americans voted. On an average, in every election, 80% of those people voted. And it was much more difficult back then. There was no mail-in ballots. There was no 15 to 20 different polling places to go to. They had one. And they had to walk if they were outside of the norm to get there. So these elections were difficult, and yet they participated. So the social structure, 2/3 of these people owned land or businesses. By the time the 1760s and 1770s rolled around, they were the seventh generation of colonists. So their ties to England were tenuous at best. These were people, many of them had never been to England. They again did consider themselves to be English, but they had never been there. So as a result, their personal ties were much fewer and further between. And you now had a diversity. By this time, only 1/3 of all the people that lived in America were of English ancestry, as opposed to 70 to 80% or 90% in many instances early on. The impact of the Great Awakening we talked about. Now, frontier life. In order to survive, you had two, in some cases, contradictory ideas. Number one, you depended upon each other for many things, so community was important. But secondly, the individual oftentimes was left on his own. So the importance of the individual, that rugged individual, the American ideal, able to do almost anything on his own. So frontier life created people that were used to being, here's the word, independent. And these people, generally speaking, had better living conditions. From top to bottom, the average American was better off overall than his counterpart in England. Now, don't misunderstand. At the very top of the social scale, most English in that top tier were richer than Americans. However, again, from top to bottom overall, Americans were better off. They were wealthier. There was a strong middle class, and they were healthier. So living conditions were quite different. And lastly, Americans were used to the British administrators of being incompetent, unknowing about the conditions that existed in America, and quite honestly, not caring either. So that's what it was like to be an American in the 1760s, which John Adams referred to. So the overall causes of the American Revolution: taxation, distance, cultural differences, and lastly, British reactions to what occurred in Boston.
British troops were stationed in Boston. The once independent capital was under military rule. England was going to teach the young American upstarts a lesson.
Now, we've talked about distance. We just referred to the cultural differences as you needed to Americanize if you wanted to survive. And we'll get a little deeper into the specific British reactions to Boston. But taxation, now that was a little bit different. Of course, and we mentioned this when we talked about the results of the French and Indian War, the British were under tremendous debt as a result of that war. In today's money, their government was in debt to the tune of $2 billion. So they needed to exhaust all forms of replenishing their treasury. And as you see there, as one of the parliamentarians suggested, it may be time but to exact a due deference to the just and equitable demands of a British Parliament. Parliament was going to ask the Americans, or I should say tell, to help replenish the British debt. After all, as many people in England would agree, it was the responsibility of the colonials. The British people at that time, people living in England, were the most taxed on earth. And Parliament was afraid to exact any other types of taxes in England to help pay off the debt. So it was only obvious that they were going to turn to the people who most benefited by the victory over the French. And that, of course, was the colonials. So a series of acts that had already actually been in force, but were not enforced, were going to be looked to. These were the navigation acts, which affected the to and fro from colonies to mother country and back again of various goods and services, if you will. For example, pine trees. Yes, pine trees. Now, this is something that definitely needled the British. Sorry, had to go there. Uh, the pine trees, not plentiful in England anymore, but of course, keep in mind, England is a island. And being an island, it relied on its navy and its ships to provide goods that they desperately needed. And to power those ships, they needed sails, and those sails were attached to rigging, and the rigging, et cetera, tall masts. And where did those masts come from? Trees. Trees which were increasingly rare in England, but more than plentiful in America. So all those pine trees were considered to be property of the crown. Of course, this was one of the things that was traded to foreign governments by the colonists, but now a limitation was placed on it. The Molasses Act is passed, forcing colonists to buy their molasses from the British held islands in the Caribbean. Now, you may say big deal, but let's go back to that phrase I mentioned with something called the triangular trade, from molasses to rum to slaves. The molasses was taken to the colonies, turned into rum, taken to Africa, traded for slaves, and the whole thing would start all over again. This was of extreme importance to many of the commercial interests in America, particularly in New England. So forcing them to buy more expensive and, quite honestly, less quality molasses from the British as opposed to the French or the Spanish in the Caribbean was something that impacted a rather growing trade in slaves. Now, the pine trees and molasses acts were already in effect. They were passed in the 1730s, but now they were going to be enforced. So salutary neglect was about to go out the window. I'll give you an example. There is a law on the books in Haddonfield which forbids people to buy baby food on a Sunday. So imagine you getting busted for possession of Gerbers. Now, is that law enforced? Absolutely not. Why is it still on the books? Who knows? But for most people, it doesn't even exist. Now, try to enforce that, see what happens. Well, this is exactly what happened in colonial America. And then you had the Paxton boys, which you talked about. Those Western Pennsylvanians from Paxton County who slaughtered innocent Indians in retaliation for some of the atrocities that were taking place as a result of Pontiac's rebellion in 1763. And then, of course, the British favoring the Indians because of the great deal of trade that was being enacted now in the Ohio River Valley. And so remember the establishment of the Proclamation Line of 1763, keeping the Americans pinned to the East Coast so that they would not interact with the Indians, allowing the British to control the trade, and in turn, and then also stopping this interaction lessened the need for military protection, thus lessening the debt. So all these things factored into the financial pressures that were going to be brought to bear. Financial pressures, much of which came from that man.
King George and old England forever. Go to hell!
Ah, yes, young King George. At this time, in the 1760s, he's only 22. Arrogant, suffering from various mental disorders, and as such, an unstable ruler. That was going to lead to problems all over the empire as King George and Parliament struggled to adapt to this new giant empire that they had won as a result of the French and Indian War. And as a result, the rule would not go well. So they were going to have to rethink the empire. First off, particularly in regards to the colonials, the British were going to attempt to prevent smuggling. Keep in mind that even though salutary neglect existed, mercantilism was a prime motivating factor for the British in their relationship to the colonists. Now, what was mercantilism? It's simple, that the colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. And if mommy's not happy, if you don't feed the beast, well, consequences will happen. The colonists avoided all of these problems by simply ignoring them early on. And they smuggled in, for example, molasses and smuggled out other things such as pine trees to be sold. And a blind eye was turned. And quite honestly, many of those people that were supposed to enforce it were corrupt. Well, now the British, in rethinking their empire, wanted to prevent smuggling. And in so doing, they were going to empower their enforcers with something known as writs of assistance. If you will, they were blank search warrants. You know that uh, search warrants today, you have to knock, knock, knock on the door, announce that you have a search warrant, and say that you're here to look for whatever the warrant maintains. Back then, a writ of assistance was a blank piece of paper carried around by the customs agents, which empowered them to look anywhere at any time for anything that might speak of smuggling. Well, this was not something that sat well with the colonists. This gave, of course, the customs agents unlimited power. It finally was going to go to court. And a man who many people are unaware of, James Otis, a lawyer in Boston, would handle the case for the colonists. As you see there, his idea was a simple one. Citizens' private property must be held in higher regard than a parliamentary law. Obviously, he lost that case, and it was ruled that Parliament, law, and custom had equal weight. A man's home is his castle, would be the famous phrase that comes out of all this. And as Otis said, you see there in red, if it should be declared illegal or illegal, would totally annihilate this privilege. They could enter our houses whenever they please. They may break locks, break through with malice or revenge. No man, no court may inquire. And Otis establishes or espouses a principle that quite honestly had been with us since the Mayflower Compact. And that was the idea that government serves the people. That was not the English system. That was not the system of any country in the world at that time. Generally speaking, it was the other way around. So the infamous writs of assistance. George Grenville will be appointed by the king as or to a post known as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. In a sense, that's like today's Treasury Department Secretary. His idea to raise money to fund the British debt would be a series of laws. The first would be the Sugar Act in 1764. Obviously, something the colonists were not sweet on. Sorry, had to go there again. This taxed sugar. Well, sugar is a prime ingredient combined with molasses in making rum. So once again, the importers and exporters involved in the triangular trade were going to be greatly affected. The Currency Act of 1764 said that all debts to English merchants and the government, which would include any type of taxes, had to be paid in hard currency. Well, keep in mind that that hard currency, shillings, pounds, sixpence, whatever you want to talk about, was made in England. And not a lot of it was coming over here. So the difficulty in securing that currency would make it difficult to pay off your debts. Just to give you an example, in Virginia, all debts, whether they be taxes or salaries that you had to pay or things you wanted to buy, was calculated in pounds of tobacco, because tobacco was the main form of currency. In other states, it might be bushels of corn, but hard currency for the average person, difficult to come by. 1765, the passage of the Quartering Act, which said that British soldiers stationed here for the quote unquote protection of the colonists were to be housed in colonial homes. And the expense of housing them in those homes would be paid for by those colonists. So they had to feed them, house them, clothe them. Not something looked favorably upon by many American homeowners. And then finally, the first direct tax on Americans. Now, understand what I mean by direct tax. The Sugar Act, that directly affected everybody, but not so they knew it. I'll give you an example. When you go and buy a car, you're given the price of the car. Built into that price are certain taxes that are paid. Import taxes, for example, if it's a foreign car, or state taxes, sometimes known as excise taxes, built into the price. You don't realize you're paying it. Do away with those taxes, and you find, for example, that your car would be cheaper. Do away, for example, with the new state tax on gasoline in New Jersey, and you could take 24 cents right off the top of a gallon of gas. But again, you're paying it without really being aware of it. So those are indirect taxes. The Stamp Act would be the first direct tax. And what did that tax do? Well, according to Sam Adams, a cousin to John Adams and a true revolutionary, he said that this Stamp Act strikes our British privileges. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves? Now think about that. That leads, of course, to that old saying, no taxation, of course, without representation. And the Stamp Act is going to underline that principle. This would be opening, according to Sam Adams and others, Pandora's box. So what the Stamp Acts did, if you take a look at that chart that I've put there on the screen, you had to pay for almost anything that involved paperwork, whether it was filing documents with the court, getting your college degree. For example, suppose when you get your associate's degree from Camden County College, they said you were going to have to pay $200. Forget tuition, that's already there. On top of it, you're paying another $200 to pick up your diploma on graduation day. Well, that's essentially what they were doing with colleges back then. I'm talking about the British. License to practice law, playing cards, every newspaper, all of it was going to be taxed. And of course, the average American, in some way, shape, or form, more than likely was going to be involved with something that you see there. So this was a direct tax on them for their usage. The reaction was not one that the British counted upon. From Georgia through Massachusetts, there was universal condemnation of the Stamp Act. And it was going to lead to violence. A group entitling themselves the Sons of Liberty, which today would be designated as a domestic terrorist group, began in New York City and then brought to new heights by Samuel Adams in Boston. This was a group that was bound and determined that the Stamp Act would not be enforced. They harassed those people that were to collect it They harassed the colonial governors, so much so that people who initially had wanted to be Stamp Act tax collectors refused to collect the tax, or they couldn't find anybody to even fill those jobs. 1765, the Stamp Act Congress is held in New York City. 12 of the 13 colonies will send representatives. And based on a document published by Virginia and its legislature in Williamsburg, the House of Burgesses, the Stamp Act resolves were passed and sent to England by the colony's representative, a gentleman by the name of Ben Franklin. And these resolves essentially said that they would not pay the tax, and moreover, that they would boycott universally all goods coming from England. And that was going to put a tremendous dent in the wallets of British merchants. As a result of the economic pressure brought by the merchants, Parliament would revoke the Stamp Act. However, in a backhanded effort, as they take away one act, install another, the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act essentially said, okay, we're taking it away, that of course being the Stamp Act. However, we maintain the principle that we can pass, we being Parliament, anything we want in regards to the colonists without their consent. Well, that was going to lead to some problems. Read the paragraph that I put there on the screen, and you can see the extent to which the Sons of Liberty and others would go to from city to city, colony to colony. In the case of the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Hutchinson, they dismantled his house brick by brick. They took all the furniture out of his house. So imagine coming home and you look at a vacant lot, and that's what the governor did. The governor, who by that time had fled the colony because he feared for his safety. This was the extent to which these rioters went. All of them, of course, believing in this new theory of representation and the idea that Parliament did not have absolute authority over the colonists. But of course, Parliament just stated that they did in the Declaratory Act. So the argument, of course, was a simple one. Was Parliament's rule absolute, as they said in the Declaratory Act? Or, as the colonists said, no taxation without representation, was it limited? You see the argument that Franklin and others had posed. How could they consent to legislation where they didn't have any representation in that body? Well, what the Parliament maintained, you see at the bottom of the screen. Colonists were pushing again for the idea of salutary neglect, which had been, quite honestly, the governmental principle since the initial landings at Jamestown. But now they're talking about virtual representation. No, we're not talking about having a Zoom meeting with the colonists. We're talking about the idea that since they consider themselves, they being the colonists, British citizens, then they were represented by Parliament. Parliament represented all British citizens. Of course, the colonists argue, but we didn't elect them. But you don't have to. They still represent your interest. And that was the idea that was held. Now, did the colonists really believe that? Yeah, they did. But they were also, now we're talking about some of the leaders of this idea, particularly Sam Adams, James Otis, and a couple of others. They were more interested, and they were in the extreme minority at this time, in independence because they knew even if they were given representation, they would be outvoted every single time. And so Parliament would be able to do anything it wanted anyway. But the idea and this phrase, no taxation without representation, was a propaganda victory for the colonists, and it held some sway with some in England. After Grenville leaves, he's going to be replaced by Charles Townshend, who invokes new taxes and new laws. Using the Declaratory Act, he enacts the following. All right, from now on, what we're going to do, we being the British, we are going to pay the salary of colonial governors. Well, wait a minute. Therefore, if they're paying the salary, who will the colonial governors be loyal to? Loyal to the crown, not to the people who were paying their salary. Now, remember, colonial governors were never elected back in those days, but he who controlled the purse strings controlled the governor. That was no longer going to be the case. And now revenue is going to be collected from external trade. In other words, we're not going to tax things that go on within the colonies anymore. We're going to tax those things which go into the colonies and those things which come out of the colonies, external trade. Most importantly, they were going to tax imports into the colonies, paper, paint, lead, glass, tea, much of which was not produced in the colonies. And for good reason. It was against the law in many instances to produce this. Again, to benefit the mother country and the domestic industries. Now, what they were going to do was appoint new customs officials. The way it worked was this. Let us say that I'm living in England and the king makes me a customs official in America. Well, I don't want to go to America. So I get some friends to do the job for me. And at each level, they're allowed to keep a portion of anything they collect. Before that, they were also allowed, and again, when I say allowed, I don't mean it was legal, but people just turn their heads, to accept bribes, not to collect those taxes. Well, now we're going to put a little bit more of a stricter control over that. Now you can't stay in England and collect the taxes from afar. You have to go there, and you will only be able to collect money that you directly collect, no bribes. And we're establishing a board of customs, first in Boston, but later it would be taken to Canada, Nova Scotia, so that if you violated these laws, that's where you would go for trial. The response to these? Well, this man pictured, John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, would write a series of essays entitled Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And as he states there, we can't be happy without being free. Now, the irony of this is later, Dickinson, a member of the Continental Congress, would vote against the Declaration of Independence and against the Constitution. But yet, his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania would be read throughout America and be an impetus for seeking independence. As a result of the Townshend duties, once again, we're not going to buy anything coming from England. Another boycott. Riots against customs agents. Some would be tarred and feathered. John Hancock, who was loyal to the crown, his smuggling ship, the Liberty, would be boarded, confiscated, along with all its goods. Right away, John Hancock goes over to the other side. And of course, we're all familiar with the famous John Hancock signature on the Declaration of Independence. As a result of these protests, Lord North, the colonial administrator in England, sends 4,000 British troops to Boston, which of course was going to create friction. Now, for the first time, many people throughout America who joined this non-importation movement would call themselves patriots. Ah, yes. And the patriots, as opposed to those people which supported the government, the loyalists, would now do battle. Much of what they believed was derived from John Locke. Locke opened the door, sorry, had to go there again, to the idea of government serving the people. He published a series of essays that were put together into his two treatises of government. Now, by the time that all this happened, Locke had long passed away, but he had passed down this idea of natural or inalienable rights, language, of course, which Jefferson uses in the Declaration of Independence about 6, 7 years later. The people have the right to life, liberty, and property, and that free men formed contracts with society. The idea being that society, aka the government, served the people. All this was done during a time that's, those of you familiar with European history, known as the Age of Enlightenment. You're going to have many Frenchmen who participate in this. Jean-Jacques Rousseau would be one, for example, that believed in this social contract theory that's going to evolve out of all of this. And now this pressure was going to result in an event known as the Boston Massacre. Now let's go back. The Boston Massacre, well, let's take a look.
This is incredible. You got a whole bunch of people in colonial dress. What's going on?
Well, the Boston Massacre happened right out here, and we're going to put you in the middle of it.
Paint me a picture.
Now, what happens with the Boston Massacre? Let's keep in mind a couple of different things. You have the Quartering Act. So you have the British troops who were approximately 1/4 of the population of Boston. So for every 4 people, you had a British soldier. So you had 4,000, and with a population roughly of 16,000 Bostonians. So that added to the crowding in the city. You have British soldiers who are stationed in the homes. You have British soldiers who are paid a paltry sum. So many of them attempted to take part-time jobs. This was a severe economic imposition on the people of Boston, who are already suffering from a colonial-wide depression, if you will. So jobs were scarce. The British were working cheaper than the colonists would. So the jobs were even more scarce, and it was the British that were taking them. So the frictions were growing. And on this day, in March of 1770, the one British officer had gone into a barber shop and then walked out without paying for having his wig powdered. Well, when the young lad who was the son of the barber came out to demand payment, the officer pulled his sword and chased him away and walked away laughing. That night, you were going to have a British sentry accosted by a bunch of teenagers. Now, the story goes that they were throwing snowballs. Really? They were throwing chunks of ice. This brought out other British sentries to help protect them. Somehow a crowd grew to about 800. You had about 17 or 18 British soldiers backed against the wall. somebody fired, a nervous British sentry, and the result would be the Boston Massacre. 5 people dead. The first one shot and killed a free black known as Crispus Attucks. There were many free blacks in Boston and other ports because many of them worked on ships that were now docked and, of course, part of the boycott. So a lot of these guys were roaming aimlessly and unemployed throughout the city streets. That's what attracted Attucks to the crowd. So 5 people dead. Now, previous to this, when the Sons of Liberty were hassling a merchant, the merchant went inside his house, pulled out his gun, and shot one of the people in the crowd, an 11-year-old boy. So now on top of this, you have what becomes known as the Boston Massacre, a brilliant depiction of what happened by the Sons of Liberty. This was propaganda at its best. 5 people killed out of a crowd of 800 is not exactly a massacre, not in the true definition of the term, but this was spread throughout the colonies, along with the painting and engraving that you see down there at the bottom. And if you take a real close look at the bottom towards the right, you will see the artist and engraver who did this painting is a gentleman whose name is going to become extremely famous in American folklore, a gentleman by the name of Paul Revere. So the Boston Massacre plays, if you will, right into John or Sam Adams's hands. Eventually, these people, the British soldiers, would be put on trial and defended by Sam Adams's cousin, John Adams, a true patriot, but he wanted the crown to see that true justice could be meted out by colonial government. All of the individuals, for the most part, were found not guilty. They were sent home, some of them branded on their cheeks, and the rest of them all sent home. And that was the end of the Boston Massacre. But it was really the end of the beginning. The next event, of course, would be the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Townshend Acts would be done away with, except for the tax on tea. Well, tea was the main thing being smuggled. And tea was a mainstay of the British Empire. You see, there were giant monopolies that were formed within the British system, one of them being the British East India Tea Company. And the government favored these monopolies. So powerful were they, for example, the British East India Tea Company, that company ran India for the British. But the British East India Tea Company was going bankrupt. Since tea was such a popular drink, the British figured, well, what we're going to do is we're going to make our tea more attractive. So they put a tax on everybody else's tea, making the British tea cheaper. And they really cracked down on the smuggling of this better tea and initially cheaper tea. Therefore, the British became the only tea in town. As a result, people, particularly the Sons of Liberty in Boston and in other cities, Philadelphia being one of them, decided to act. So one night, disguised rather poorly as Mohawk Indians, they, of course, are going to throw what essentially amounts to almost $5 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. No violence occurred. They even cleaned up the ships after they finished dumping the tea overboard. But this was the last straw as far as the Crown and Parliament was concerned. So now more troops are sent in, more taxes are sent in, and they're going to be rigidly enforced. All of the things that you see there on the screen were going to lead to an environment ripe for revolt. This was a perfect storm, much of it of England's own making.
You will be assimilated.
So, to make them cow to British rule, a series of laws known as the Intolerable Acts were going to be passed by Parliament. They closed the port of Boston. And of course, Boston was primarily a commercial city, so this would plunge them into economic chaos. No more Massachusetts government. Their assembly was out, and they would be ruled by the king's representative, a general by the name of Thomas Gage. Gage first came to America during the French and Indian War, and he became very friendly with an American by the name of George Washington, as the two of them were involved with General Braddock and that abortive attempt at the beginning of the war to get rid of Fort Duquesne. Next, the Justice Act would be passed, referred to by the colonists as the Murder Act, saying that any British employee, whether it be a soldier or a government official, that is charged with a crime would be taken back to England to be tried, could not be tried in the colonies. Colonists therefore deemed this the Murder Act, because literally they all, we're talking about the British soldiers, could get away with murder. The Quartering Act was reestablished. And lastly, not really part of the Intolerable Acts, but lumped together with them by the colonists, something known as the Quebec Act. What the Quebec Act did, if you take a look at the map, was to take certain portions of Canada drifting into the Ohio Valley and put them under rule from the Canadian capital. And they also said that all people living in that portion, we're talking about Canada now, particularly Catholics, would have equal rights. Well, immediately, the colonists said that it was the Catholics that were going to take over, that the crown was going to force us to all become Catholics. Well, that was not the case whatsoever, but this is the way that it was portrayed. Again, a brilliant propaganda move. And once again, an action taken by the British without a true appreciation of what the consequences would be. They never thought what would happen in Canada would be translated as something that would happen in America. But that's exactly what they did. So, September 5th, 1774, the First Continental Congress. Again, there was no unity in what they wanted to do and then what should the ultimate result be. Once again, they went to the well, perhaps one too many times, to halt all trade. And again, using Franklin, they opened secret negotiations in London. They sent yes, they sent with him the olive branch petition, a petition which the king refused to even look at. The colonists were willing to recognize the authority of Parliament, however, and the howevers, of course, were certain concessions that they wanted, but the king refused to even look at them. So here's what you've had, starting with the proclamation line of 1763, going through the various events, whether they be taxes or friction with British rule, the establishment of committees of correspondence. This became the colonists' Facebook, because now letters would be taken via their form of the internet, Pony Express riders, if you will, riding up and down the colonies, letting each other know what was going on and what actions they should take. Shortly thereafter, the First Continental Congress would come, a problem. Problems, again, that were exacerbated for the British by what you see on the screen. These colonists were no longer all English. You had a diversity among the colonists. Population had grown greatly. By the time that this was all coming down, over 2.5 million people living in the colonies. And each generation, remember this was the seventh generation, further removed from loyalty to the crown. You had an extremely young population. And as such, more prone to violence and more prone to action than older people. Again, economically, generally speaking, they were better off than their English counterparts, and they were well read. So they understood what was going on. They knew what was going on, and they didn't like it. Just let's take the Boston. Let's take the Boston Tea Party for just a quick moment. The average American was a tea drinker. The British put a tax on tea coming from outside, wanting you to buy the cheaper but not as good British tea. If they paid that tax, the average American would pay approximately $2 more a year. And to pay that $2, they would have to drink about 15 gallons of tea per person. Now, think about that. So, were they really being hurt? But it was the principle of the thing. The first battle of the war would open on a morning in April of 1775 on the greens of Lexington. April 19th, 1775. The shot heard round the world and the beginning of the military revolution.